Good day all. This talk will examine the Marxist approach to the media. For Karl Marx, the central role of the media is to spread capitalism's ruling ideology. An ideology may be defined as a set of ideas and values which promote the interests of one group or class over those of others. Modern society contains various ideologies. Racism is an ideology that promotes the interests of one race or ethnic group over others, usually whites over non-whites. Sexism is an ideology that promotes the interests of one sex or gender over the other, usually men over women. The ruling ideology promotes the interests of the ruling class over the other classes, especially the working class. Because the ruling class rules, it is in a position to impose its ideology on society as a whole. This is why Marx said that, quote, "The ruling ideas of every society are the ideas of the ruling class." In capitalism, the capitalists own the media, so they make sure that their media only present pro-capitalist ideas and values to the general public. Marx did not live to see the rise of the electronic media, but he did see how the ruling ideology was spread by the press, and he saw it from the inside. The only jobs Marx ever held were as a journalist. He worked for newspapers in Germany, Austria, Britain, and in the 1850s he even became a European correspondent for the New York Tribune. One of the things that Marx observed firsthand was that newspaper owners and editors had close personal ties of friendship and even family with other leading businessmen and politicians. This is a finding that many studies have confirmed since then. The upper class form a closed clique, which is basically one big happy family. Naturally, media owners support their friends and relatives in the business class. For Marx, there is no question that the media spread the ruling ideology. The only question is, how effective are they in doing so? Here, Marx was contradictory. On the one hand, he said the ruling ideology rules. But on the other hand, he spent his whole life fighting against that ruling ideology. All of Marx's writings are ultimately an attempt to expose the lies of capitalism and bring the working class to class consciousness, where they would understand their class position and understand how they're being ripped off by the capitalists. I would argue that the support shown for big capitalists like Donald Trump in the US shows that Marx failed in his goal, but that he was right the first time. The ruling ideology rules. After Marx's death, Marxist theories of ideology in the media gradually split into two main schools of thought, most commonly termed the cultural studies approach and the political economy approach. I shall begin by looking at the cultural studies approach because this is the approach that emerged first and in which more has been written. The cultural studies approach begins with the work of the Frankfurt School. In 1923, the Frankfurt Institute was established in Frankfurt, Germany, and it brought together a number of leading Marxist theorists, including Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Walter Benjamin. But in 1933, Hitler and the Nazis took power in Germany. The only people Hitler hated more than Marxists were Jews, and many members of the Institute were Jewish, so most of them fled to the US. Not all of them. Walter Benjamin said that someone had to stay to fight this evil, and he refused to leave. This was very brave, but not very smart. The Nazis put him in a concentration camp where he died. Meanwhile, his fellow Institute members were finding out that in the US, Marxist was pretty much a dirty word. So they changed the name of their ideas from Marxism to critical theory, because it's critical of modern capitalist society. While in Germany, they'd been very impressed by the ways in which the Nazis used the media to gain power. And the Nazis, like all major right-wing parties, were financed primarily by big business. For German industry, the Nazis' program of a big military build-up meant big government contracts and big profits. So the Frankfurt School connected their critique of the media and of Nazism to their critique of capitalism in general. In the US, the focus of that critique naturally shifted to Hollywood. Horkheimer and Adorno, both together and separately, wrote about how capitalism, particularly Hollywood, had turned Western culture into what they called the culture industry, which these days is more commonly termed the entertainment industry or the mass media. I shall use the term culture industry as long as we're looking at the Frankfurt School, but I am still talking about the media. The Frankfurt School argued that the invention of industrial mass production and the electronic media had given the ruling class a much greater ability to spread the ruling ideology and shape how people think than any ruling class had ever had before. To be clear, the media are not the only social institution that spreads the ruling ideology. On the contrary, every single major institution does so in its own way. Businesses, political parties, schools, churches, everything. But modern technology has allowed the media to play a greater role in supporting the ruling ideology than ever before. Horkheimer and Adorno argued that mass production had allowed the culture industry to create mass culture. Early capitalism was made up of many small businesses, so there was genuine competition and their products had variety and individuality. But by the mid-20th century, capitalism in general and the media in particular had reached the stage of corporate oligopoly. Horkheimer and Adorno argued that in practice, this oligopoly usually operates like a monopoly. Once there's only a handful of players in the game, they can all get together and cooperate more than they compete. They all agree to keep wages at the same low level. They all agree to raise their prices together. And they all agree to put out basically similar products. This is called collusion, and it's illegal, but it still happens every day in the capitalist economy. In the entertainment industry, this means that they all put out similar shows with similar plot formulas, similar characters, similar ads, and so on. In other words, media products have become standardized into a few basic types, just like cars or chairs. Media representatives sometimes argue that this standardization is an inevitable consequence of using the technology of mass production. But Horkheimer and Adorno argue that the problem is not with the technology, it's with the social organization of that technology into capitalist corporations. When a handful of capitalists control the media, then it's inevitable that the media will put out the same few standardized pro-capitalist ideas over and over again. The leaders of the culture industry constantly tell us that they want novelty and new ideas, but they don't. What they really want are new variations on old ideas. They want another rehash of the standard formulas. The capitalists' motivation for this is the only capitalist motivation there is: money. Capitalists sometimes like to portray themselves as risk-takers, gambling fortunes on a wild idea. But the truth is that anyone investing a large sum of money in any enterprise normally tries to minimize that risk as much as possible. They want the closest thing they can find to a proven winner, a sure thing. They don't want to invest in something that's never been tried before and might lose all their money. They want a new wrinkle on something that made money in the past. This is why we live in an age of sequels and reboots. This is also why anything that's a success in one medium promptly gets remade in other media. For example, just about every story written by Stephen King has been turned into a movie or a TV show. The leaders of the culture industry want the old repackaged to look new. The best way to do that is to focus on new technology, because what capitalism does best is to develop new technology. The same old plot formulas can be made to look new by incorporating new technology like computer-generated imagery, CGI. Horkheimer and Adorno had a phrase to describe this. They said, quote, "The machine rotates on the same spot." Here, they were comparing capitalism to a giant machine, like a turbine. Over time, the machine gets bigger, stronger, and faster, but it doesn't go anywhere. In other words, the technology improves, but society stays the same, still divided into the rich capitalist class and the poor working class. This standardization of Western culture into a mass-produced culture or mass culture stems simply from the capitalists' desire to make money. However, said Horkheimer and Adorno, whether they intended it to or not, mass culture also has an ideological impact on society. Mass culture repeats the same few standardized pro-capitalist ideas and values over and over. And, thanks to the electronic media, this mass culture is everywhere. On screens, on posters, on billboards, wherever you look, you see the same corporate products, the same corporate logos, and the same corporate ideas. Mass culture is so all-pervasive that it comes to seem like a natural part of our lives and a natural part of our thinking. We go along with it because it doesn't even occur to us to question it. We get sucked in to capitalism's ruling ideology without even realizing it. Horkheimer and Adorno argue that the media do not try to ram the ruling ideology down our throats, because that wouldn't work. If they just kept saying, capitalism is great, capitalism is wonderful, then nobody would listen to them. They have to be more subtle than that. For example, movies and TV shows sometimes portray evil corporations or mean capitalists as the bad guys. The show appears to be anti-capitalist. but not really. Because these are just stereotyped characters going through standardized plot formulas. Everyone knows that they are fictional. They're not the real stars of the show. The real stars are the products. Portraying the rich, even as bad guys, allows the media to show off all the high-end products that ordinary people would otherwise never see. The limousines, the private jets, the mansions, the $1,000 suits, and so on. The unspoken, hidden message in all of this is what you want. You want all the goodies that capitalism can provide. You don't want to overthrow the rich capitalists. You want to become a rich capitalist. And that is how millions of working-class Americans came to identify with and vote for Donald Trump. In recent years, the media have taken the next step in this process with the introduction of the policy of product placement. Products have moved from the background to the foreground. For example, if a car company is one of a movie's sponsors, then at some point in the movie you can guarantee that a car will come right up to the camera lens so that the corporate logo is front and center, Ford, Mercedes, or whatever. Or, if one of the characters drinks a can of soda, they're going to position the can so that you can clearly see the logo, Coke, Pepsi, whatever. Essentially, capitalism has turned all of Western culture into one giant ad. This in turn means that capitalism has redefined the average person from citizen to consumer. The difference is that a citizen is active, but a consumer is passive. A citizen is involved in the public life of society. A consumer just consumes what the corporations tell him to consume. A consumer is someone who just sits on the couch and waits for the capitalists to show him the next product to consume, because they know what he wants even better than he does himself. The culture industry also ensures that the world of leisure is becoming increasingly similar to the world of work. They're both controlled by the capitalists through their ownership of technology. They've both been standardized and routinized. And in both of them, the average person is becoming increasingly passive. We go to work and produce what and how the capitalists tell us to produce, and then we can come home and consume what and how the capitalists tell us to consume. Even when we appear to see through the ideology, it makes no difference. We complain about how routine our job is, but we still go to work. We complain about how predictable and formulaic TV shows are, but we still watch them. Over time, the routines even become comforting. We know what to expect. There are no unpleasant surprises. You can even tune into the middle of any show, and within a few seconds you know what plot formula you're in, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and you're good to go. You know the good guys will win in the end because they always do, at least in fiction. So you can just slot into the same old groove and sit there without thinking, without making any effort, hypnotized by the flashing lights on the screen. Unlike the print media or even radio, movies and TV leave nothing to the imagination. Everything is spelled out. All that remains is to consume it. Even trying to think about what you're watching is difficult because the pace of the action keeps speeding up. You don't have time to think because there's a car chase or a gun battle or explosions. Thought is replaced by automatic responses, programmed in by years of repetition. You laugh or cry or feel on cue. The hero shoots half a dozen people dead and then makes a little joke, so you laugh, signifying that it's okay and he was justified in killing those people because he's the hero. But when the hero's dog dies, then you cry. Your emotions are pre-programmed. They know how to push your buttons because they installed those buttons through years of repetitive plot formulas. The leaders of the culture industry always claim that they are just giving the public what they want. But Horkheimer and Adorno say that the general public does not know what they want until the capitalists tell them what they want. You didn't know that you wanted the latest brand of jeans until the ads told you that you wanted them. And you didn't know you wanted sitcoms or game shows until the media showed them to you. In capitalism, needs are manufactured just like the products that supposedly satisfy those needs. But in reality, only the rich can really satisfy their needs. Only the rich can have the yachts, the sports cars, the mansions, and so on. All that the average person can have is the image of these things on a screen. Look, but don't touch. Spend your whole life dreaming for something that you'll never have. That's why they call Hollywood the Dream Factory. Finally, at the very heart of the culture industry lies what I like to call the paradox of individualism. On the one hand, capitalist culture constantly promotes individualism. We're told over and over to be an individual, be yourself, don't just follow the herd, and so on. Books, movies, and TV shows almost always focus on an individual protagonist. It's very rare to see shows that are about social movements or social issues or collective action. Instead, we get good guys against bad guys, or even just one good guy against the bad guys. The lone hero always triumphs against the odds. In other words, against society. He loads up with all the armaments he can carry, kills a few dozen bad guys, rescues the girl, and if he's James Bond, he defuses an atomic bomb along the way and closes out the movie by getting the girl in bed. The paradox is that all of these so-called individuals are identical. All action-adventure heroes are basically the same character, whether they're played by Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Van Damme, Vin Diesel, or whoever. As Horkheimer and Adorno say, their individuality, quote, is mass-produced like Yale locks, whose only differences can be measured in fractions of millimeters. And at that, the culture industry allows its stars more individuality than capitalism allows most workers in factories or offices. Indeed, each celebrity is expected to have their own personal style, a certain way of speaking or dressing or perhaps doing their hair. The media can then turn these small personal idiosyncrasies into a big deal. They can create an image around them, which can then be turned into a brand name. Just like a corporation, once an artist has a recognizable brand name, then they can be marketed to a mass audience who will show brand name loyalty and buy anything put out by that artist. The ideology of individualism not only helps the capitalists to make money, it also strengthens their rule over society. Because the process of individualization is also a process of privatization or social isolation. Marx said that the only thing capital fears is collective action. Individuals cannot challenge the rule of capital. Only a lot of people working together can. And in pre-capitalist society, culture used to be collective. Whether it was folk festivals, dances, theatre, or even religious observances, culture brought people together. It promoted collective sentiments. But these days, everyone's at home watching a screen. In the early days of TV, at least the whole family gathered around the TV set. But these days, dad's in one room watching sports, mom's in another room watching soaps, and the kids are in their room watching cartoons. Everyone is being an individual. Of course, for slowing the spread of COVID, such social isolation was a good thing. But normally, it's a bad thing, in that it prevents the organization of collective action. Nobody's going to get together and fight for their rights if everyone's home watching TV. Horkheimer and Adorno developed their critique of the culture industry in the 1940s. It was added to in the 60s by Herbert Marcuse, who developed the concept of one-dimensional society. He argued that pre-capitalist societies had a number of different values and that people were judged along a number of different dimensions: their family background, their education, their religion, their morality, and so on. But in capitalism, there is only one value that matters and only one dimension that people are judged by. And that is, of course, money. In capitalism, everything and everybody is measured in terms of how much money they're worth. And that is all that really matters about them. Marcuse went on to say that the power of money had given capitalism a uniquely effective way of dealing with its critics. The aristocracy dealt with their critics through force. They were imprisoned, whipped, or executed. But while force works in the short term, it only builds up public resentment over the long term. Moreover, forcible repression gives the critics legitimacy. The very fact that the authorities are trying to silence the critics tells the general public that what they're saying is probably true. The authorities would not be beating and killing them if they weren't afraid of what they're saying reaching the general public. So, over the long term, repression is counterproductive. Capitalism does not use repression except as a last resort. Most of the time, capitalism prefers to use its money to buy off its critics. It does this by incorporating them into the culture industry. critics are encouraged to write books, make movies, and become successes. Not only does this make the capitalists money, but just as repression grants legitimacy, success takes it away. If the critic becomes a success and makes a lot of money, he loses his credibility. People start saying, he's criticizing the system, but he's doing all right out of it. He's complaining about the rich, but he's getting rich. For example, I have read reviews leveling exactly that criticism at Michael Moore, who has made several well-known anti-capitalist documentary films. Since most people do not personally know the social critic, the general public can't be sure whether their social criticisms are sincere or whether he's just saying them to make money. And so the critic's words are heard, but they do not have much of an impact. And so nothing changes. Allowing critics to speak permits capitalism to boast about its commitment to freedom of speech. We're told that capitalism is such a great system that it has no fear of its critics. They can say what they like because ultimately they have nothing to complain about. In other words, freedom of speech provides legitimation for capitalism. Over the long term, permitting controlled dissent works a lot better than just suppressing dissent. The carrot works better than the stick. Paying critics works better than beating them. This is the case because becoming a success changes the artist. For example, well-known Canadian singer Bryan Adams. In his early years, he was very political. He wrote about topics like war and unemployment. He played for Live Aid and Amnesty International. But then he became a big star, living in the lap of luxury. And suddenly, society didn't look so bad to him. He stopped writing about unemployment and instead started writing silly love songs like everybody else. He even saw this change in himself. He said, quote, "I'm getting less political the older I get. I've realized you just can't change anything without becoming part of the system and having the system change you in the process." Marcuse argued that the culture industry had changed the nature of art. Before the big corporations took over, artists had more freedom. And so they made art that challenged and provoked people. Art that made people think about their society, even sometimes think critically about their society. That's gone now, said Marcuse. The critical function of art has been destroyed by the culture industry. Instead of making you think, the culture industry tries to prevent you from thinking with its endless succession of high-speed images. The only thing we are supposed to think about is money. We're told over and over that making money and spending money are the only things that really matter in life. Art only matters if it makes money. And the media are right there to tell you how much money it made. For example, the papers regularly carry top 10 lists of the highest earning movies with dollar amounts of how much they made. Very often you're told how much the movie cost to make as well as how much it made so that you can establish its profit margin, which is ultimately what matters to the capitalist. When a movie makes number one, ads immediately start saying, "Come see this because it's the top grossing movie in the country today." In other words, it made a lot of money, so it must be good. You can, of course, find similar top 10 lists for books, CDs, DVDs, video games, and every other major product of the culture industry. The message here is that all that really matters about any of them is how much money they made. Capitalism has turned all works of art into commodities, things for sale on the market. And not only that, but capitalism takes popular works of art and turns them into ads to sell more commodities. For example, these days, practically every hit song soon ends up as background music on some ad. So does well-known classical music, and so do well-known paintings like the Mona Lisa or the Scream. Art has been put in the service of capitalism. And when all your art and culture are constantly telling you that money is the most important thing in the world and that your whole life should be primarily about making money, then after a while, you don't question that. You take it for granted. Questioning the importance of money and the power of those who have money comes to seem irrational, and for most people becomes literally unthinkable. The Frankfurt School believed that no working class revolution had taken place or would take place in the West because the Western working class had been brainwashed by the culture industry to the point where they're literally incapable of seeing the flaws of capitalism and support it no matter how bad it gets. And you know what? When tens of millions of American workers vote for Donald Trump, it's hard to argue with that. However, while the Frankfurt School makes some good points, they've also been criticized. In particular, they have faced 4 main criticisms. Firstly, they've been criticized for overestimating the influence of the media. They see people as brainwashed robots, incapable of thinking for themselves, totally controlled by the media. They see people that way because that's what they saw for themselves in Nazi Germany. But, as I said when we looked at structuralism, Nazi Germany was an exceptional situation. In stable Western democracies, the media do not have that kind of power. They have some influence, certainly, but not as much as the Frankfurt School claim. Secondly, other Marxists have criticized them for overestimating the importance of culture. Marx said that the most important thing in society is always the economy and people's economic circumstances. So, if the Western working class have not risen up in revolution, it's not because they've been brainwashed by the culture industry. It's because capitalism came up with something new to improve the working class's economic circumstances, namely the welfare state. Welfare does not provide enough money to get out of poverty, but it does provide enough money to keep you alive. And as long as people know where their next meal is coming from, they're not going to risk their lives in a violent revolution. Thirdly, they've been criticized for overestimating the power of the leaders of the media. Certainly, corporate executives run media organizations and they make the ultimate decisions. However, executives are not artists. Executives rarely come up with any kind of new media product that will sell because that's not really their job. The content of the media comes not just from the artists that corporations employ, but from society as a whole. For example, music. No corporation could ever have come up with musical styles like punk rock, rap, or hip hop. They were created on the streets. Punk was born as the voice of alienated white urban youth in Britain, and rap and hip hop are the voice of alienated black urban youth in the US. None of those styles are nice or pleasant or middle of the road. They're loud and angry because that's how their creators feel. They're voices of working class protest. However, as Marcuse said, the culture industry buys off capitalism's critics. These days, rap songs get used as background music in ads, just like all other musical styles. For example, ads have used the music of rappers MC Hammer and Eminem. So, as British Marxist Raymond Williams said, quote, "The media work by incorporation rather than imposition. Corporate heads cannot just impose any products and ideas that they want onto the general public. In order to be popular and make money, they have to emerge organically from society. They have to have an audience who can identify with them. They have to embody the values and beliefs of a social group with a particular subculture. Because if they don't have that, then they don't have an audience. For example, looking at other musical styles, country and western embodies the values of the country or rural workers. Family, trucks, and beer, not necessarily in that order. Heavy metal embodies the values of those who work with heavy metal, urban construction workers and factory workers whose music emphasizes strength, power, and even violence, and so on. These things have to emerge from society in a grassroots manner. They cannot be imposed by corporate CEOs in a top-down manner. Fourth and finally, the Frankfurt School have been accused of being elitist. This is actually an accusation that's been levelled at Marxist theorists in general. Marxists claim to speak for the working class, but the problem with that is that Marxist theorists are not working class, they're middle class intellectuals. The Frankfurt School constantly compare the products of the culture industry to fine arts like theatre, opera, and ballet, and declare that, relatively speaking, the bourgeois art that the culture industry produces is of inferior artistic quality. However, these fine arts were never the art of the working class or the common people. This was always art created for an urban middle-class elite. The high technical standards of the fine arts have always been middle-class standards rather than working-class standards. Middle-class professionals want to do the best job possible. The working class just want to get the job done. The middle class want excellence. The working class just want competence. No one will listen to you if you don't know how to play your musical instrument, but you don't have to be the greatest musician in the world for people to listen to you. For example, opera. There is no question that opera singers who have spent years training their voices are technically superior singers to rock and rollers who just picked up a guitar and started singing. And yet, rock and roll is much more popular than opera. Why? Because a working class audience cannot identify with a voice which has been trained to where it sounds almost inhuman. But they can identify with a gravel-voiced rock and roller who sounds like he's had a few too many cigarettes and whiskies. The key to media success is not product quality. It is audience identification. If your audience identifies with the values and norms expressed in your product, they'll buy it. If they don't, they won't. Theodor Adorno was the Frankfurt School's foremost music critic. And Adorno said that all music should be judged in terms of its seriousness or intellectual depth. Not only that, but audiences should also be judged in terms of the seriousness or depth of their musical knowledge. Adorno distinguished between different levels of audience and said that the only people who could really judge and appreciate music were the people on the top level, the experts, the professional musicians, and professional critics like Adorno himself. This is clearly elitist. Adorno was saying that only the educated middle class can really understand or appreciate music. In practice, Adorno was replacing the upper class emphasis on money with a middle class emphasis on education. The capitalists have the money, so they say money is the most important thing. The middle class have the education, so they say education is the most important thing. Both of them claim to speak for the working class, but neither one really does. The Frankfurt School does not represent the values, attitudes, or tastes of the working class any more than the culture industry does. After the Frankfurt School, the next prominent Marxist media analyst to arise was American Noam Chomsky. Chomsky first became well known in the 1970s, particularly for his criticism of how the US media handled international news. He argued that the media had given in to political pressure from Washington and slanted its coverage of world events so as to support US foreign policy. In particular, if any foreign government which was not a US ally, which back then mostly meant communist governments, did anything bad like violating human rights, then it made the front pages in the US. But if the foreign government was a US ally and it violated human rights, as US-backed governments all across Central and Latin America frequently did and still do, then it either was not reported on at all, or if it was, it got a little paragraph buried in the back pages. This remains very much true to this day. Chomsky, following David White, argued that US media leaders acted as gatekeepers, deciding what the general public does and does not hear about. In doing so, they were engaging in agenda setting, establishing an agenda for public debate that favored the US government. Everyone was talking about the bad things being done by the US's enemies, and nobody was talking about the bad things being done by the US government and its foreign allies, since hardly anybody heard about them. Moreover, since most of the world's media buys their international news from US-based Associated Press, AP, or United Press International, UPI, the US press does not just set the agenda for the US, they set it for most of the world. Herbert Schiller in the 70s described this as cultural imperialism. American culture and American capitalist ideology are pushing out local cultures and taking over the world. In 1988, together with Edward Herman, Chomsky published a book called Manufacturing Consent, which was made into a film in 1992. Here, Chomsky argued that the ruling class can only rule if the ruled class consent to be ruled and do not stage protests or revolutions. Industrial capitalism uses the media to manufacture consent in the working class, just like it manufactures cars or anything else. He said that the media incessantly pours out capitalist propaganda in a variety of ways. He said the media contains many hidden pro-capitalist biases and hidden pro-capitalist messages. He even went so far as to say that the media engaged in what he called thought control, especially as regards politics, and that this was undermining democracy, allowing a small minority to hijack the will of the majority. Chomsky argued that the media do not just spread capitalism's ruling ideology by promoting specific ideas. Rather, capitalist ideology is built into the very way that the media operates. For example, TV news. The news does not just present information, the news processes information. Events that happen in the world are like the raw material of the news industry. As in any industry, that raw material has to be processed and packaged before it gets to the consumer. Information has to be turned into a commodity that can be sold on the market. TV news does this by turning events into little stories that are on average about 1.5 minutes long. Chomsky argues that that alone introduces a conservative bias, because in 90 seconds you cannot introduce and explain any new ideas. All you can do is trot out the same old cliches that the audience is familiar with. After he became well known, Chomsky was often interviewed on TV, and he would frequently get interrupted halfway through making a point because they had to go to ads. And by the time they came back, half the audience had changed channels and the other half had forgotten what he was talking about. The same thing has been said more recently at the University of Regina. In 2011, a panel was organized there to discuss the role of the media in politics, including academics Tina Baudry-Meller and Jeff Leo. The university newspaper, The Carillon, ran a story on it, which included a brief extract, which I would like to read to you now. Baudry-Meller, who is often interviewed by the media, expressed frustration over how the important points she makes regularly get cut from the news. Leo mentioned that TV news stories are about 1 minute 40 seconds long. Baudry-Meller's complex analysis of important subjects would be hard-pressed to fit into that space. Chopping up the news into brief little segments also makes it more entertaining, more like an action movie where the pace gives you something new every minute or two. And, as in an action movie, this means that you have no time to actually think about any one of the stories because you're already on to the next one and the next one. The news becomes superficial, with no time for any real analysis or understanding. Information becomes infotainment. Chomsky is not the only one to have commented on this. Robert McNeill of the McNeill-Lehner NewsHour has said that the guiding principles of commercial TV news are: keep everything brief, bite-sized is best, and complexity must be avoided at all costs. American journalist A. Kent McDougall has similarly said that newspaper editors always say that they want objective reporting which gets the facts straight. However, by the facts, they mean the details, names, places, dates, and so on. But any analysis of these facts is discouraged. It's not considered objective. Editors want journalists to report on what happened, but not why it happened. They want daily events, not long-term trends. And that's how the news gets superficial, not analytical. Like I said, information becomes infotainment. Chomsky also argued that the way TV news reports on politics has a built-in conservative bias. First of all, TV has changed the nature of election campaigns. Before TV, political rallies were held in the evenings so that people could come to them after work. But now, the TV audience is much bigger than the physical audience. So rallies have become media events, which are held in the afternoon, so that they get a clip on the evening news. And politicians know that that clip is only going to be about 90 seconds long. So they don't bother anymore with long speeches, carefully explaining where they stand on the issues and what their policies are, because that's not going to make the news. What will make the news is a brief, striking image. The candidate standing tall, with a giant flag behind him and balloons going up and fireworks going off and pretty girls bouncing up and down, shaking their pom-poms. The issues have become forgotten because we have entered the age of personality politics. Vote for me because I'm a nice guy with a nice smile, not because I'm actually promising to do anything for you. Personality politics has arisen partly because Hollywood's star system has created the cult of the celebrity. There are more celebrity websites on the internet than any other kind. Our culture is obsessed with celebrities. And politicians, like movie stars, are celebrities. This, however, introduces another conservative bias. Because if politicians are stars, then that gives them star power. The media cannot afford to antagonize their stars. If a reporter interviews a politician and asks some hard-hitting, awkward questions, then the next time he asks for an interview, he's going to get turned down. And if he adopts that same tough attitude with all the politicians he interviews, then pretty soon, none of them will speak to him. That means that he won't be able to do his job, and that pretty soon he'll be fired and replaced by someone who will ask only cream puff questions. How's the family? Is that a new hairdo? It sounds silly until we remember how much fuss the media has made over Justin Trudeau's hair, and, in a more negative way, Donald Trump's hair. Personally, I think hair's overrated anyway. Chomsky argued that the media support capitalist democracy and undermine true democracy by giving the people the illusion that they are participating in the political process. TV shows us the politicians so that we think we know them and we think we're making an informed choice when we vote. But all we really see are just superficial media images, smiling faces that tell us nothing about what these people will actually do if elected. TV brings us two things: images and words. Both of these are manipulated by the capitalist media to introduce a subtle but effective conservative bias. As regards images, I want to give you an example that I myself have observed in TV news several times over the years. There's a strike. TV news always claims that it's impartial and provides both sides of the story, so it shows interviews with both management and strike leaders. But the images that are presented of management and workers are very different. The manager is interviewed in his office, behind a desk, wearing a suit and tie, maybe with some awards or certificates on the wall behind him, looking very professional and responsible. In short, looking like someone who knows what he's talking about. Then the strike leader is interviewed. On the picket line, in rumpled clothing, maybe sweaty and dirty from walking around for half the day, holding a sign. In short, not looking so impressive. And the TV crew know that if they just wait a while, then some delivery truck is going to try to get through the picket line, the strikers aren't going to let him, and there'll be a confrontation with yelling, which might even lead to some pushing and shoving, maybe even punching. Now that's action, not just talking heads. So of course that footage is going to make it on the news. And that makes the striking workers look like angry, violent, dangerous people who are disrupting the economy. Regardless of what either side says, the images alone make management look good and the workers look bad. And it's not just the quality of the image, it's also the quantity. A recent study found that business persons are interviewed on TV about 10 times as often as labor leaders. For me, this is a perfect microcosm of capitalist culture. Capitalism offers free speech, but not equal speech. In capitalism, everybody gets to speak their piece. But big business will use its money to make sure that its viewpoint gets spoken 10 times as often as the other side's. When 90% of what they hear is pro-capitalist, that's what most people come to believe. The words that the media use also make a difference, because words can have positive or negative connotations. The same person can be described in positive or negative terms, depending on your point of view. For example, probably the most negative term widely used in today's media is that of terrorist. But if you ask the so-called terrorists themselves, they'll probably describe themselves as freedom fighters. In practice, the US media describe any such group that supports the US as freedom fighters, and any such group that opposes the US as terrorists. Similarly, the American media calls some politicians from poorer countries valued political allies, while opponents of the US get called third world dictators, even though in practice both use the same brutal and bloody tactics to rise to power. This same kind of pro-US, pro-capitalist, right-wing bias can be found in the words chosen not just on TV news, but throughout the capitalist media. Moving beyond the news, Canadian Dallas Smythe has argued that entertainment programs also have hidden, built-in conservative biases. He argues that TV programs are really just another kind of ad for capitalism, especially for the values of capitalism. I'm going to now read out a brief extract from Smythe's work that summarizes how TV manipulates people. But before I do, I first have to note that this was written in 1981. And since then, the West's global boogeyman has changed. So, wherever Smythe said communist, I'm going to update that to terrorist. Apart from that, nothing has really changed since Smythe wrote this over 40 years ago. Quote, "The mass media screen in the values of the capitalist system and screen out other values. The agenda set by the mass media is explicitly or implicitly ideologically loaded to support the system. A condensed summary of such values illustrates. Human nature is portrayed as fixed. You can't change human nature. It is typically and incurably selfish. Therefore, look out for number one. Let the other fellow take care of himself. In every area, what is private is better than what is public. Private business is clean and efficient. But some people are dishonest and mean, and they'll be punished by a heroic individual or the efficient military or police forces. Public government is inherently dirty and inefficient, and, of course, politics is a dirty business. It follows that prices charged by private business are good, because private businessmen have to meet a payroll and are efficient. But taxes, which in economic terms are indistinguishable from prices, are bad. And because public officers need not show a profit, they are inefficient. Private property is virtually sacred. And public planning, which would tell property owners what to do with their property, is inherently bad. But sometimes bad, miserly landlords should be punished by the community. In fact, that government is best which governs least, leaving everything possible to be provided by the market. We should be objective and respect each other's opinions, unless the others are terrorists. In that case, they're part of a bad international conspiracy. They're not good Canadians or Americans and ought to be sent back where they came from. The difficulties which capitalism experiences in third world countries are stirred up by terrorists. When our corporations' interests in the third world are threatened by discontented peasants or workers who want to elect governments which would serve their interests rather than those of our corporations, we should support military takeovers, under which our friends can pursue their policies. Force is the only thing terrorists understand. But foreign policy is too complex for citizens to understand, and therefore decisions should be made by the head of state and his military advisors. Technology and winning are the most important values for us enlightened individuals. As we learn from professional sports, nice guys finish last. Our high moral ends justify our means. We are the defenders of the free world and will accept any nuclear risks to preserve our system. Any such summary of dominant values is deliberately simplified. The texture of the ideology is more complex. In TV, for example, family values are emphasized as against individualism, and similarly, small groups are given meaning as against raw individualism." Unquote. The first thing Smythe says here is that the media make it appear as if capitalism is based on human nature. We're told over and over that people are innately selfish and greedy, so we come to accept a social system based on greed as only natural. Greed is good, is a famous line said by Michael Douglas as a businessman in the movie Wall Street. Getting rid of capitalism would be going against human nature, so it can't be done. Everyone is only looking out for number one. So if you get involved in any social causes like helping the poor or saving the environment, then you are just being played for a sucker by people who are taking advantage of you. The only people besides yourself that you're supposed to care about are your family. The media is always big on family values because having a family gives your employer power over you. You can't fight against him because you can't risk losing your job when you have dependents counting on you to put a roof over their heads and food on the table. So the media are always big on family, but not on larger things like social movements, which very rarely get covered. The problem with this image of human nature as based on personal greed, or what's been called possessive individualism, is that it simply is not true. For the first 90% of human history, all people lived in hunting and gathering bands. And in the band, what mattered was not the individual, but the band. In tribal cultures all over the world, children are taught to put the group before themselves. Individual ambition is discouraged. Helping others is encouraged. And since these bands were nomadic, moving around in search of food, everyone periodically had to pack up and carry all of their possessions on their backs. This meant that greed, in the modern sense of wanting to accumulate more and more possessions, was literally a physical impossibility. You could not own more than you could carry. Greed, as we know it, is a relatively modern invention, promoted in particular by capitalist culture and capitalist ideology. Without the media telling people and over how much they want more stuff, people wouldn't be so greedy. Human nature is not fixed. It changes as socialization changes and people are taught different norms and values. So it is possible to build a society that's not based on greed the way capitalism is, because that is the type of society that humanity lived in for most of its history. American media analyst Todd Gitlin has identified certain techniques that TV uses to make itself more effective in getting through to the viewer. First, TV uses the technique of self-contradiction. TV always tries to have it both ways. It always tries to attract an audience from both sides of any issue or controversy. It does that by presenting a product that is ambiguous or even self-contradictory, but it will hide the contradiction so that people don't see through it. Most commonly, TV hides things in plain sight like this by creating a discontinuity between images and words, which means that TV says one thing but shows us another. Usually, it says the politically correct thing but shows us something more right-wing. A few examples. TV always tells us that sexism is bad and that women shouldn't be treated as sex objects the way they are in porn movies and porn magazines. TV will say, "Aren't all these images of naked women terrible?" Not sure yet? Here, look at some more images of naked women. The words appeal to those who want to fight sexism, while the images appeal to those who just want to look at naked women. Similarly, TV says, violent crime is bad, so let's shoot all the criminals. In action shows, the heroes are just as violent as the villains, shooting and killing their enemies wholesale. Violence is supposedly condemned, but is actually glorified and made into the solution to all of life's problems. Another example. TV constantly tells us that what matters in life is love and family and friendship and being kind to others. But what TV shows us is that what matters is winning, being a success, making a lot of money, and owning a lot of fancy possessions. Ads show us that what really matters is owning the products in the ads. This contradiction can be seen particularly in children's cartoons. The dialogue is always totally sappy, all about friendship and love. But the images are in practice one long ad for the show's action figures and other merchandise. And when the show goes to ads, they're often ads for those action figures, so that the show and the ads blend together into one seamless whole. For example, the famous Pokemon slogan, "Gotta catch 'em all," which really means, gotta get mom and dad to buy 'em all for me. While supposedly promoting love and friendship, these kids' shows are actually promoting greed and consumerism, the values of capitalism. The second TV technique that Gitlin identifies is that of self-reference. TV creates its own little world where media people talk about media people, and it all has less and less to do with the real world. Shows like Entertainment Tonight talk about the entertainment industry. Talk shows have actors and musicians on promoting the latest movie or music. There are endless awards shows, Oscars, Emmys, Grammys, People's Choice Awards, and so on. No other industry pats itself on the back as much as the entertainment industry. Perhaps that has something to do with entertainers' need for applause, but it also helps to boost sales. These days, there's a whole TV channel, Star TV, that only looks at what's going on inside the entertainment industry, alongside many magazines like Star Magazine and Entertainment Weekly. The more media people talk about each other, the more they build up our celebrity culture. As I said, there are far more celebrity websites than any other kind. Media celebrities are talked about until they get built up into these almost superhuman figures. However, says Gitlin, then the media take the next step to ironic self-reference. First, they make someone into a cultural icon, then they make fun of that icon. First, they put them up on a pedestal, then they knock them off it. Comedians do humorous impressions of celebrities. Impersonators even make a living out of it. It's been estimated that worldwide there are over 5,000 professional Elvis impersonators. TV shows make fun of imaginary TV shows. Murphy Brown originally parodied a TV news show called FYI, later called Murphy in the Morning. Tim Allen's sitcom Home Improvement made fun of an imaginary DIY show called Tool Time, and so on. Movies do the same thing. Mel Brooks made a career out of doing movie parodies like Young Frankenstein, Robin Hood Men in Tights, Spaceballs, and so on. More recently, the Wayans brothers have done the same thing, parodying whole movie genres with movies like Scary Movie, Date Movie, Epic Movie, and so on. The attraction of this self-reference is that it's perfectly safe. It's just the media making fun of the media. Nobody's going to get offended. Nobody's going to get upset. Because none of it's about the real world. It's just the media talking about the media. However, says Gitlin, being constantly exposed to ironic self-reference in the media, especially on TV, has an effect on the audience. It creates a certain attitude in the audience, an attitude of ironic detachment. TV can show us the whole world in extreme close-up, but even as it does, it detaches us from that world. TV floats above it all. It is the omniscient and untouchable observer. And as a viewer, you can share in that detachment. You can share in the sense of superiority that comes from floating above it all. You can watch other people get shot or blown to bits while you sit safe on your couch. You can watch children starving to death in Africa while you munch popcorn. You can feel concerned about all the suffering and problems in the world while congratulating yourself that none of it's happening to you. On TV, it's real, but it's not real. You're involved, but you're not really involved. You see death and destruction, but it's just entertainment. Whatever you see, remember, it's just TV, so don't take it too seriously. It's all just in fun, so don't get too worked up about anything. Above all, don't think that you actually have to do anything about what you see on TV, except keep watching TV. As long as the viewer maintains an attitude of ironic detachment, they can criticize TV, they can complain about how formulaic and predictable it is, they can feel superior to TV, but they're going to go right on watching TV. As long as people believe that TV is not worth taking seriously, then TV can be effective. People think that entertainment programs provide just entertainment. They think that the news provides just the facts, but they don't. The media contain hidden messages and hidden biases that slip past our guard because we're not looking for them. And those hidden messages and biases always present pro-capitalist ideas and values like greed, individualism, competitiveness, ambition, and consumerism. But if Marxists point this out, then they're accused of taking TV too seriously, of not getting the big in-joke that the media have created around themselves. And so they're ignored. So far, we've been looking at the cultural studies approach within Marxism, which focuses on how the content of the media promotes capitalist ideology. We turn now to the political economy approach, which focuses on how the structure of the media as businesses within capitalism leads them to promote capitalist ideology. I'm going to refer to some of the same theorists that we've already looked at, but now they'll be making different kinds of points. First of all, as we shall see in my talks on media history, the media, like the economy in general, has gone through a process of capital concentration, meaning that it started out with a large number of small businesses, but over time, through bankruptcies, mergers, and takeovers, they become concentrated into a small number of large businesses, a corporate oligopoly, where about half a dozen large corporations dominate each medium. The Frankfurt School argued that this has led to cultural standardization, because these top corporations all copy each other and end up putting out virtually the same products. But in the late 20th century, we saw something else: capital diversification. A business normally begins by putting out one type of product. As it grows, it starts by taking over its competitors that are making the same kind of product. But if it keeps growing, then eventually it reaches the point where it diversifies by taking over companies that are making other kinds of products. The advantage of diversification is that if demand for one of your products falls, then you still have income coming in from other products, so you're less likely to go bankrupt. In the media, it's common for a company to start out in one medium, say TV, then diversify into other media like radio, movies, and internet, and then to take over or merge with other companies that are completely outside the media. The company then starts promoting its non-media products in its media outlets. And also, media owners become partners with non-media capitalists. This makes media owners part of the larger business community and gives them an even bigger incentive to use their media to promote capitalism in general. Media owners can influence their media in two ways: directly or indirectly. In the early days of the press, newspaper owners directly told their journalists what kind of stories they were expected to write. In England, for example, Lord Beaverbrook, one of the big newspaper owners, stated explicitly that his papers were to express only right-wing views and that any of his journalists who did not would be immediately fired. These days, owners generally prefer to run things more indirectly. This happens in a couple of ways. Firstly, rather than run the paper himself, the owner hires an editor who he knows shares his right-wing views and lets him do it. But secondly, these days, editors rarely have to directly tell journalists what to write. Excuse me. Rather, the editor establishes role expectations for his journalists. In any job, you have to meet your employer's expectations of you, or you'll get fired. So, whenever anyone starts a new job, the first thing they do is try to figure out exactly what is expected of them. They try to fit into the office culture. So, usually, the editor doesn't have to spell it out for them, because they figure out for themselves what he's looking for. To put it another way, editors rarely have to censor journalists because journalists self-censor. Only they don't think of it as censoring themselves, they just think of it as fitting in. As regards politics, most journalists, especially most young journalists, are middle of the road and have no firm commitment to either right-wing or left-wing. Politics isn't really that important to them. They just want to do their jobs and make careers for themselves. So they just go along with the conservative, right-wing culture that the editorial staff establishes in the office. And so most of the media ends up being conservative and right-wing. North America does not have a single mainstream newspaper that is not right-wing. At the last federal election, every single mainstream newspaper in Canada urged Canadians to vote Conservative. Britain does have The Guardian, which is a respected, relatively left-wing mainstream newspaper. But in Canada and the US, left-wing views can only be found in the alternative press, such as Saskatchewan's Prairie Dog, which of course means that relatively few people ever read them. The mainstream press will have the occasional relatively left-wing article, but only very rarely. A. Kent McDougall was a left-wing American reporter who said that the only way he could get his articles published in the US mainstream press was to devote over 90% of his articles to right-wing themes. If he did that, then the editors would allow him to sneak in the occasional left-wing piece, but even then, those articles would always be edited and toned down. He said that he had to constantly argue with editors to try to persuade them to let him write different kinds of articles than the ones they usually published. In addition to the influence of owners, editors, and management on the media, there's also the influence of advertising. Except for the internet, all of North America's mass media are primarily financed by advertising. Dallas Smythe even went so far as to say that the modern mass media were created by and for advertising. In the 19th century, when businesses were still relatively small, there was very little advertising, mostly just small ads in newspapers and magazines. Big corporations first arose in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and quickly turned the capitalist economy into a set of overlapping corporate oligopolies. These corporations invented brand names, and that's when advertising really took off. Brand names give companies an advantage. Before brand names, most products were sold as generic or no-name products, so people would just buy the cheapest one they could find. But with a brand name, you can raise your prices and say, "We're not the cheapest because we're the best." Brand names imply higher quality, and they inspire brand name loyalty. Ketchup means Heinz. There are no other kinds. Well, yes, there are. But if you've been brought up on Heinz, then for you, there are no other kinds. So, brand name loyalty can translate into big money. Smythe argues that it is no coincidence that corporations arose, the mass media came into being, and the advertising explosion took place, all right at the start of the 20th century. He argues that once corporations arose that needed and could afford mass advertising, they created the mass media primarily for that purpose. Everything else in the media is just designed to draw you in to watch the advertisements. As Todd Gitlin says, quote, "TV shows are the meat in a commercial sandwich. You watch for the meat or show, but you end up consuming more of the bread or ads." In economic terms, advertising is demand management. Corporations cannot just make products and hope people will buy them. They manage and create demand through advertising. They convince you that you absolutely have to have something that you didn't even know existed 5 minutes ago. Corporations spend millions of dollars studying patterns of demand, channeling demand, tailoring products to people, and tailoring people to products. Advertising defines everyone as a consumer, and so manages the kind of person you are by managing the types of things you consume. As consumers, we're told that the solution to all our problems is always to find the right thing to consume. Got a headache? Buy some pills. Hungry? Buy some junk food. Depressed? Why then just go and buy whatever looks good. It'll make you feel better. We're told repeatedly that what matters are products, not people. Things, not relationships. And once we accept our role as consumers, then we just consume what the corporations tell us to consume. Smythe also argues that the main thing that the media create is not media products for sale to audiences, but audiences for sale to advertisers. The media, especially the press and TV, make only a minority of their income from their audience. They make the majority of it from advertisers. The media create audiences and turn them into commodities which they sell to advertisers. TV does this through programming. Different types of programs attract different types of audiences. Programming breaks down the general public into specific audiences or social groups. That way, corporations can target those audiences that are most likely to buy their products. For example, if your business is making some manly products like trucks or power tools or beer, then you advertise during a program that a lot of men will watch, like sports. If you're making domestic products of more interest to women, you advertise during a program that a lot of women will watch, like soap operas. That's why they're called soap operas, because soap companies sponsor them. And if you're making toys or candy, then you advertise during a show that kids will watch, like cartoons. So, whatever your product, TV has an audience for you. Moreover, since 1947, almost from the very beginning of TV programs in North America have been rated by the Nielsen ratings. These ratings establish approximately how big each program's audience is. And having audiences of different sizes means that media companies can cater to different advertising budgets. If you've got a big budget, you can pay more and get a show with a big audience. If you have a smaller budget, then you can only afford a smaller audience, but TV still has one for you. So, in terms of both the type of audience and the size of the audience, different programs give the media different audiences to sell to different advertisers. In conclusion, Marxists argue that both the content of the media and the structure of the media promote capitalist ideology. The media contains both hidden conservative biases and hidden conservative messages. From carefully chosen words and images to the influence of owners and advertisers, the media have methods to persuade the general public to accept the rule of capital. These days, we're surrounded by so much right-wing propaganda that it's come to seem normal to us. Right has become the new center, and the left basically died back in the 70s and 80s. In Canada, I would characterize our main federal parties today as right, righter, and rightist. You can figure out which is which. In the US, businessman Donald Trump first became a media celebrity, then used his fame to become president. His election shows that big business controls politics even more thoroughly in the US than in Canada. While Karl Marx was certainly not right about everything, he was right in saying that the capitalist media spread capitalist ideology, and that this ideology is very influential on society as a whole. That concludes what I have to say on the Marxist approach to the media. A transcript of this talk is available if you're interested. Good day.